Hello, and welcome to this presentation on the Mill Village. Have you ever heard the phrase, it's a company town? Today we think of a company town as a city or town where one single business employs a large percentage of the population. A city like, say, Cupertino, California, where Apple Computer is. You could say that Cupertino is a company town. A significant portion of the city's revenue is generated by the company and by its employees. The phrase actually comes from the Industrial Revolution. This was a period where the company actually owned the entire town. In 1793, Samuel Slater of Slater's Mill in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, realized that if he provided housing right next to the textile mill, employees could walk to work in just minutes. He could attract more employees with the prospect of these kinds of benefits, the mill town, and he could keep an eye on his employees, even when they were off work, monitoring their behavior, make sure they were modeling proper behavior. Initially, Suttersville, as it was known, was just housing for the employees of the mill. But Slater realized he needed to provide more than just a house for the employees. Eventually, Slatersville would come to include not just single-family houses, what we now call duplexes, and apartment blocks for the employees. Each employee or their family would be assigned their living quarters based on their job status. Say a manager in a single-family home and the average worker in an apartment block. These villages had to grow, and they would eventually include a company store, church, and a school. The idea worked so well that, in fact, it was modeled all over New England. Now, wasn't something that only Slater envisioned. This was also something that was happening in the UK. Slater was just the first person to implement the company village here in the US. Workers were initially seduced into working at the mills by what appeared to be high wages and the convenience of having this mill town with everything close by. But it's really important to understand that the mill owners weren't being magnanimous. They were renting these houses to the employees, and the goods that were sold at the mill store were put on the employee's account, and they would be paid for later. All of the goods sold at the mill store were sold at a profit. So they weren't just passing the goods along to the employees. They were making money off of the employees from that. And this included the workers' food. Now, some mills provided short meal breaks once or twice during the day. Some provided meals for the children who were attending school. Usually they'd have some sort of simple breakfast in the morning, and then after school they would have a lunch and then go to work in the mill. And remember, they were working 12, 14, 16 hours a day, everybody in the family. The mill owners didn't want the workers passing out, obviously, but they also didn't want them to go home for these food breaks. They wanted to keep them close to the mill where they could keep their eye on them. And the food wasn't free. It would be billed to the family's mill store account. Also, the churches were usually the owner's denomination, regardless of what the workers' preferred denomination was. And the schools were established for a specific purpose. The schools were training the children to be good, loyal employees. They would also be assessing them and training them for specific jobs in the mill. Children who excelled might find themselves in a middle management or even management position at some point. This, of course, after they had worked in the mill for quite some time. Families in these mill towns were working together, not necessarily side by side, but they'd all be working at the mill in different jobs. Men, women, and children. Children sometimes as young as 6 years old. They might go to school in the morning, and then after lunch, they would go to work in the mill. Most of the youngest children were cleaning up, sweeping up things. But everybody worked long hours, and everyone worked 6 to 7 days a week. Some of the religious mill owners might give employees Sundays off if they went to church. Many would also just give a half day off so mill workers could attend church. Workers owed the mill rent for their homes, and they also owed them for the goods purchased on account at the mill store. And, of course, any food that they ate while they were at work. Mill workers often owned the mill more money on payday than they were actually making in that pay period. And this was true for families where the dad, the mom, and 2 or 3 of the kids were all working 14 hours a day or so, and they were still not making enough with their income combined to meet the family's bills, what they owed the mill store at the end of that pay period. So these families would go into debt just trying to survive while working at the mill. Mill village life could be brutal and dangerous. It was not uncommon for workers of all ages to be injured, maimed, or even killed in the exposed machinery. Small children, remember we're talking about 6, 7, 8 years old, would literally climb into the machinery to clear jams or make repairs on the equipment that they were trained for. And they would sometimes lose a finger clearing a jam because they were doing this while the machinery was still running. Most textile mill workers developed respiratory ailments, some even diseases, from the constant exposure to the fiber dust that could be so thick in the air it would look like a heavy fog. Breathing that in all day, 12, 14, 16 hours a day, 6, 7 days a week. It was a harsh condition. And these harsh conditions would eventually inspire labor movements to form, trying to improve workers' conditions. Labor walkouts and strikes by workers in protest for worker safety considerations. These kinds of things were met with very violent, iron-fisted brutality, resulting in serious injuries and sometimes death to some of the striking workers. This started early on. You had strikes very early during the Industrial Revolution. In that last decade of the 18th century, so 1790 to 1800, there were strikes starting to happen, and they continued to gain momentum and grow during the 19th century, after 1800. Workers started to form labor unions to collectively bargain with industry owners for safety and higher wages and shorter hours. In fact, the first labor union was formed in Philadelphia in 1794, and this was Shoemakers and Cobblers Union. So you can see that this idea of unionization had started fairly early during the Industrial Revolution. The brutality of industry owners and the strike breakers, this would last well into the 20th century. The first child labor laws that were enacted weren't enacted until 1916. So the entire 19th century, from 1800 to 1900, there were no legislated workers' rights. Adult workers wouldn't have any kind of workers' rights legislation until the 1930s. It's important to think about how much the worker was at the whim of the mill owner and the industrial site owner, and not just in the mill villages, but just in general. Their entire existence was determined based on the mill owner and their personality and their desire to make money. So they weren't restricted by labor laws until the 20th century. 100 years of industrial development where the worker was at their employer's whim. That's a really important concept to understand. Thank you very much. Have a great day, and see you on the next video.